I never thought I'd be the kind of man who'd find himself questioning the very foundation of his marriage. Marcy and I had been together for almost as long as I could remember, through my nearly 30 years in the army, through countless deployments, and through the upheaval of transitioning to civilian life. Ours wasn't a perfect marriage, no one's is, but I thought we had built something strong enough to weather the storms that it started small. Little things. The way she'd avoid eye contact during our video calls while I was deployed. The way she seemed distant when I came home, as though she'd already moved on to a life that didn't include me. The first time someone planted the seed of doubt in my mind, I brushed it off. An ex-girlfriend reached out of the blue, to warn me about Marcy. She claimed she'd heard rumors through mutual friends, whispers about Marcy's behavior while I was away. At the time, I chalked it up to jealousy, dismissed it as the meddling of someone still holding on to old grudges, but the doubts lingered. Then there were the late nights at the hospital where she worked, her phone seemingly glued to her hand, and the locked laptop I wasn't allowed to touch. HIPAA rules, she'd say with a nervous laugh whenever I asked. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that after decades of living in high-alert combat zones, I didn't know how to trust the quiet moments, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Looking back, the signs were all there, but I wasn't ready to face them. After all, admitting the cracks meant admitting that everything I'd fought for, every sacrifice we'd made, wasn't enough, and that was a truth I wasn't ready to confront. Not yet. The doubts kept gnawing at me, though I tried to bury them under the noise of daily life. I told myself I was overthinking it, reading too much into things that didn't matter. But as time passed, it became harder to ignore the discrepancies. Marcy had always been passionate about her job as a nurse. She worked long hours, especially after her promotion to a supervisory role. That part wasn't unusual. But what was unusual was the way she talked about Dr. Trey, a physician she'd started working with more closely. At first, it was harmless enough, praising his skills, mentioning how much he cared for his patients. Then it became more personal. She'd laugh about his sense of humor, share stories about inside jokes they had at work. "We're just friends," she'd say when I raised an eyebrow. "He's married, too. Stop being ridiculous." But I wasn't sure I was being ridiculous. It all came to a head when she announced, almost casually, that she'd be traveling to South America with Doctors Without Borders. It wasn't the trip itself that bothered me. I knew how much she cared about using her skills to help people in need. But the way she talked about the trip, how excited she was, how she spent more time discussing the logistics with Dr. Trey than with me, felt like a red flag I couldn't ignore. I tried to push the thought aside. She's dedicated to her work, I told myself. Don't be the insecure husband who questions everything. But then there was the way she packed, carefully hiding her phone every time it buzzed and getting defensive when I asked simple questions about her itinerary. It wasn't until she left that I started to connect the dots. Late one night, I was scrolling through my emails when I noticed a folder she'd accidentally synced to our shared account. Curiosity got the better of me, and I clicked. What I found wasn't damning, not yet, just emails between her and Dr. Trey discussing their work on the trip. It was the beginning of the end, though I didn't know it at the time. After Marcy left for South America, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Her absence, which I had been used to during deployments, felt heavier this time. It wasn't just the physical distance, it was the emotional chasm that had grown between us over the years. The emails I'd found haunted me, even though they weren't outright evidence of betrayal. I kept telling myself it was all in my head. But late at night, when the house was silent and the memories of our younger, happier days crept in, I started to realize how much we had changed. Marcy and I used to share everything, dreams, fears, frustrations. But now it felt like I barely knew her. I couldn't remember the last time she'd looked at me the way she used to, with that mix of love and admiration. As the days passed, I started paying closer attention to the little things I'd ignored before. I combed through my memories of the past few months, searching for clues I might have missed. The way she'd laugh at her phone while texting. The way she'd quickly change the subject if I asked about her coworkers. The way she seemed more alive when she talked about her work than when we talked about us.it wasn't long before I found myself doing something I never thought I'd do, digging deeper. I hated the idea of snooping, it felt like a betrayal of the trust we built over the years, but I needed answers. I needed to know if the life I thought we built together was real, or if it had been crumbling while I was too blind to see it. That I started with her emails. Most of it was work-related, just as I'd expected. But every now and then, I'd find something that made my stomach twist, a personal message from Dr. Trey, filled with compliments and inside jokes that felt too intimate for a professional relationship. Then there were the photos. They weren't explicit, but they didn't have to be. Pictures of the two of them laughing during a hospital fundraiser. A candid shot of him fixing her hair before a group photo. And then, the most damning one, a selfie of the two of them at a restaurant, his hand resting casually on her shoulder, her face lit up in a way I hadn't seen in years. That I told myself it could still be innocent. But deep down, I knew better. The final straw came when I found a deleted folder on her laptop. I'd managed to recover it, something I'd learned during my years in the army, and what I found shattered the last bit of denial I'd been clinging to. Messages between Marcy and Dr. Trey, discussing their trip to South America in a tone that left no room for misinterpretation. References to our time together and making this work were the final nail in the coffin. That I sat there, staring at the screen, feeling like the air had been sucked out of the room. My hands trembled as I closed the laptop. I didn't know whether to cry, scream, or punch a hole in the wall. For years, I had convinced myself that the sacrifices I'd made for my country, for my family, were worth it. But now, sitting alone in an empty house, I couldn't help but wonder if I'd sacrificed the wrong things. When Marcy returned from her trip to South America, I was determined to confront her. The evidence I'd uncovered sat like a weight in my chest, heavy and suffocating. I'd rehearsed what I wanted to say 100 times in my head, but nothing could have prepared me for the moment I stood face to face with her. She came through the door, all smiles, looking tan and refreshed from her time abroad. I couldn't help but notice how she avoided my eyes, though, and how quickly she changed the subject when I asked about her trip. It was amazing, she said, unpacking her suitcase in the kitchen. We did so much good work, and the people were incredible. Life-changing, really. Her words sounded hollow to me, like she was reading from a script. I leaned against the counter, my arms crossed, trying to keep my voice steady. Marcy, I started, we need to talk. She froze for just a moment, her back to me, before turning around with a forced smile. Sure. What's on your mind? I took a deep breath, feeling my heart pound in my chest. I know about you and Trey. The color drained from her face. For a second, she looked like she might deny it, but then her shoulders slumped. What are you talking about? She asked, her voice defensive. You know exactly what I'm talking about, I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. The emails, the photos, the messages about your time together. Do you think I'm an idiot? She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, she looked away, her jaw tightening. It's not what you think, she finally said, her voice trembling. Then explain it to me, I demanded, my anger boiling over. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been lying to me for months, maybe years. Was this going on before the trip? Or did you decide to make it official in South America? Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't feel any sympathy. Not yet. It wasn't like that, she said, shaking her head. I mean, we got close, yes, but it wasn't serious. It was just a distraction. A way to cope with the stress. A distraction? I repeated, my voice dripping with disbelief. Is that what you call sneaking around behind my back? A distraction? I didn't mean for it to happen, she said, her voice breaking. I was lonely, okay? You've been so distant, and I felt like you didn't care anymore. Trey was just there. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to scream, to lash out, to make her feel the same pain she'd caused me. But instead, I just stood there, staring at the woman I thought I knew, feeling like a stranger in my own marriage. Do you even hear yourself? I asked, my voice cold. You're blaming me for this? For your betrayal? She didn't respond, just stood there, tears streaming down her face. And in that moment, I realized that no explanation, no apology, would ever make this right. That I walked out of the room without another word, leaving her standing there in the wreckage of what was left of our marriage. The night after the confrontation, I sat alone in the house that no longer felt like home. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards or the hum of the refrigerator. I'd been through firefights, lost brothers in arms, and faced down more danger than most people could imagine, but nothing had ever gutted me the way this did. The betrayal felt personal in a way I couldn't fully articulate. It wasn't just about Marcy and Trey, it was about everything their affair represented. The years of sacrifice, the lonely nights overseas, the times I'd wondered if I was doing enough for her while I was away, all of it felt meaningless now that I replayed the confrontation over and over in my mind, dissecting every word, every tear, every excuse she'd made. Her claim that she'd felt lonely cut me the deepest. Lonely? Did she think I hadn't been lonely too? I'd spent months, sometimes years, in places where the only thing keeping me alive was the thought of coming home to her. To us, but as much as I wanted to hate her, I couldn't. Not entirely. That was the worst part. For all her flaws, Marcy had been my partner for so long that I couldn't imagine my life without her. I couldn't help but think about the early days of our relationship, before the deployments, before the distance. We'd been so full of hope back then, so sure we could handle anything life threw at us. Now, I wasn't so sure that I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat on the couch with a bottle of whiskey, scrolling through old photos of us. There we were on our wedding day, smiling so wide it looked like our faces might split in half. There we were at the beach, her hair tangled from the wind, her laughter echoing in my memory. And then there were the recent ones, the forced smiles, the distance in her eyes. The signs had been there all along, but I'd been too blind to see them. Or maybe I'd seen them and just didn't want to admit what they meant. By the time the sun came up, I felt like a shell of myself. I hadn't cried, I wasn't even sure I could anymore, but the weight in my chest felt unbearable. I knew I couldn't stay in limbo forever. That I had two choices, fight for our marriage or let it go. Both options felt impossible. And the days that followed, I found myself caught in a whirlwind of emotions I couldn't control. Anger, sadness, confusion, and even guilt cycled through me in relentless waves. One moment, I'd convince myself that leaving Marcy was the only way forward. The next, I'd find myself clinging to the memories of the life we'd built together, hoping against hope that there was still something worth salvaging. Marcy had been avoiding me since the confrontation. She stayed in the guest bedroom, her silence speaking louder than any words ever could. I could hear her crying sometimes, muffled sobs that would cut off the second she realized I was near. Part of me wanted to comfort her, to tell her that we'd figure it out, but I couldn't. Not yet. Instead, I threw myself into anything that could distract me. I went for long runs, pushing my body to its limits until my legs felt like they might give out. I cleaned the house from top to bottom, scrubbing away the dust and grime as though it might somehow cleanse the mess my life had become. But no matter what I did, the pain was still there, simmering just below the surface point. One night, unable to sleep, I found myself scrolling through forums online, searching for stories from people who had been through similar betrayals. I read about couples who had fought tooth and nail to save their marriages, about those who had walked away and never looked back. None of it gave me the clarity I was looking for. I thought about calling someone, maybe a friend from my army days, someone who'd understand what it was like to feel betrayed by someone you trusted with your life. But the idea of saying it out loud, of admitting to another person that my marriage was falling apart, felt like too much. So I stayed silent. Marcy tried to talk to me once. She approached me cautiously one evening as I sat on the porch, staring out at the darkened sky. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't look at her. "What's there to talk about?" She trailed off, then started again. "I know I hurt you. And I hate myself for it. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need you to know that I never meant for any of this to happen." Her words hung in the air between us. I wanted to believe her, to believe that this wasn't who she really was, but the hurt was still too fresh. "I need time," I said finally. She nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "I understand." After she went back inside, I stayed on the porch for hours, replaying the conversation in my mind. Part of me hated her for what she'd done, but another part of me hated myself for still loving her despite it. At the end of the night, I knew I had to make a choice. Staying in limbo wasn't an option, not for me, and not for her. I had to decide whether to fight for what we had or walk away and start over. The turning point came one afternoon when I realized I couldn't do this alone anymore. I'd spent days, maybe weeks, trapped in my own head, trying to untangle the mess of emotions I felt. But no matter how much I ran, cleaned, or stayed up late torturing myself with what-ifs, I wasn't getting any closer to an answer. I needed perspective, and that meant reaching out to someone who could offer it. The first person I thought of was Mike, one of my closest friends from my army days. We'd been through hell together, and if anyone could understand the weight of betrayal, it was him. Mike had always been the kind of guy who told it like it was, no sugarcoating, no bull. I called him one evening, unsure if he'd even pick up. It had been months since we last talked, but the second he answered, it felt like no time had passed. "Hey, man," he said, his voice warm and familiar. "Long time no talk. What's going on?" I hesitated, unsure how to start. I've got a lot on my mind, Mike. Thought you might have some wisdom to share." He chuckled. "Wisdom, huh? You sure you called the right guy?" Despite myself, I smiled. That was Mike, always finding a way to lighten the mood, even in the darkest times. "I'm serious," I said, my voice heavier now. "Things aren't great on my end. Marcy, I trailed off, unable to say the words. "She cheated on you, didn't she?" Mike said, his tone sharper now. The bluntness of it hit me like a punch to the gut, but I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "Yeah," I said quietly. "She did." For a moment, there was silence on the other end of the line. Then Mike let out a low whistle. "Damn, man. I'm sorry. That's a tough one." "Yeah," I said, my voice hollow. "Tough doesn't even begin to cover it." We talked for hours that night. I told him everything, the emails, the confrontation, the way Marcy had looked at me with tears in her eyes, begging for forgiveness. I even told him about my own guilt, about the part of me that wondered if my long absences had pushed her into Trey's arms. Mike listened without interrupting, and when I finally ran out of words, he spoke. "Look," he said, "I'm not gonna tell you what to do. This is your call, and only you can make it. But here's what I know, you've been through worse than this, and you've come out stronger every time. Whatever you decide, whether you fight for this marriage or walk away, you'll get through it. But you've gotta stop beating yourself up, man. This isn't all on you." His words hit me harder than I expected. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again, like the weight on my chest had lifted just a little. "Thanks, Mike," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I needed that." "Anytime, brother," he said. "You know I've got your back." When I hung up, I felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, sadness, and a glimmer of hope. I wasn't any closer to making a decision, but for the first time, I felt like I didn't have to figure it all out on my own. After my conversation with Mike, I realized I needed more than just a friend's support. I needed professional help. I'd spent so much of my life solving problems with action, with logic, with grit, but this was a problem I couldn't fix with sheer determination. The next morning, I found myself dialing the number of a counselor I'd been referred to months ago, back when Marcy and I first started drifting apart. I hadn't called then because I thought we could handle things on our own. Now, sitting in my car outside the house, I realized how wrong I'd been. When the counselor, Dr. Lambert, answered, her voice was calm and soothing. She asked me a few questions, her tone professional but empathetic. Before I knew it, I'd scheduled my first session for later that week. Walking into that office felt like admitting defeat. I'd always been the strong one, the one people leaned on. Now, I was the one looking for answers. Dr. Lambert greeted me with a warm smile and gestured for me to sit. "So, what brings you here today?" she asked, her pen poised over a notebook. For a moment, I couldn't speak. The words felt heavy, like saying them out loud would make everything more real. But then, slowly, I began to talk. That I told her about Marcy, about the affair, about the confrontation and the weeks of silence that followed. I told her about my own guilt, about the nagging feeling that my years in the army had created a distance between us that neither of us knew how to bridge. Dr. Lambert listened without judgment, her eyes kind but focused. When I finished, she leaned forward slightly, her hands resting on her lap. "It sounds like you've been carrying a lot," she said. "Not just the betrayal, but the weight of your own expectations and responsibilities. It's no wonder you feel stuck." Her words hit me harder than I expected. I'd spent so much time blaming Marcy for what had happened, but hearing it framed this way made me realize how much blame I'd placed on myself, too. Over the next few sessions, we started unpacking the layers of my marriage, how Marcy and I had drifted apart, how we both stopped communicating, how the pressure of my career and her work had created a divide neither of us had known how to cross. "I'm not excusing her actions," Dr. Lambert said one day, her voice firm. "Infidelity is a choice, and it's a breach of trust. But it's also important to recognize the patterns in your relationship that may have contributed to the distance between you two." Her words weren't easy to hear, but they made sense. I started to see the cracks that had formed long before Trey entered the picture. The nights when I was too tired to listen, the moments when Marcy seemed to need something from me that I didn't know how to give. One session, Dr. Lambert asked me a question that stopped me in my tracks. "What do you want, moving forward?" It seemed like such a simple question, but I didn't have an answer. Did I want to fight for my marriage? Could I forgive Marcy, rebuild the trust we'd lost? Or was it better to walk away and start over, leaving the pain behind? I left that session feeling more conflicted than ever, but for the first time, I felt like I was starting to understand the roots of the problem. This wasn't just about Marcy's betrayal, it was about the years of neglect, the unspoken resentments, and the emotional distance that had grown between us. As I drove home that day, I realized that whatever decision I made, it had to be one I could live with. Not for Marcy, not for anyone else, for me. After weeks of silence and avoidance, I decided it was time to talk to Marcy, not just to confront her, but to try and understand how we had gotten here. I still didn't know if I wanted to save our marriage, but I knew I couldn't move forward without hearing her side of things, raw and unfiltered. That evening, I found her in the kitchen, sipping tea and staring out the window. She looked tired, like the weight of everything we'd been through was finally catching up with her. I hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Can we talk?" I asked. She turned to face me, her expression cautious but hopeful. "Yeah," she said softly. "We should." We sat at the dining table, the same table where we'd shared so many meals, celebrated birthdays, and planned our future together. Now, it felt like neutral ground, a place to air the truths we'd both been avoiding. "I need to know why," I began, my voice steady but firm. "I need to understand how we got here. How this happened." She looked down at her hands, twisting her wedding ring nervously. For a long time, she didn't speak, and I thought she might shut down again. But then she took a deep breath and started. "I don't know if I can give you an answer that will make sense," she said, her voice trembling. "But I'll try." She told me about the loneliness she felt while I was deployed, how she had tried to be supportive and strong but often felt like she was living a separate life. She talked about the moments when she felt invisible, like she was just another part of the machine that kept our lives running while I was gone. "I'm not saying that excuses what I did," she added quickly, meeting my eyes. "It doesn't. But it was like I started looking for connection anywhere I could find it. And then Trey came along, and he made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years." Her words hurt, but they also struck a chord. I had spent so much time focused on my own sacrifices, my time away, the physical and emotional toll of my service, that I hadn't fully considered hers. I'd expected her to wait patiently, to hold everything together while I was gone, and to pick up where we left off as if nothing had changed. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, my voice tinged with frustration. "Why didn't you say you felt this way?" "I tried," she said, her eyes glistening with tears. "But every time I brought it up, it felt like you didn't want to hear it. Like you had so much on your plate already, and I didn't want to add to it. So I stopped trying." I leaned back in my chair, her words settling in like a weight on my chest. Had I really been so blind? So caught up in my own world that I hadn't seen what was happening right in front of me? We talked late into the night, laying bare the grievances, misunderstandings, and unmet needs that had festered between us for years. Marcy apologized for the affair, admitting that it had been a selfish and reckless escape from the pain she didn't know how to address. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said, her voice breaking. "I don't even know if I deserve it. But I need you to know that I regret everything, hurting you, betraying your trust, throwing away what we had." Her vulnerability caught me off guard. For the first time since the confrontation, I saw a glimmer of the woman I had fallen in love with all those years ago. "I don't know if I can forgive you," I said honestly. "Not yet. Maybe not ever. But I think we owe it to ourselves to figure out what we want, whether that's moving forward together or apart." She nodded, wiping away a tear. "I want that too." It wasn't a resolution, but it was a start. For the first time in weeks, I felt like we were on the same page, two broken people trying to make sense of the wreckage. The days after our conversation were a strange mix of hope and tension. For the first time in what felt like forever, Marcy and I were talking, not just surface-level conversations, but real, meaningful discussions about our lives, our marriage, and the damage we'd done to each other over the years. That it wasn't easy. Every word felt like walking on a tightrope, balancing between honesty and the fear of reopening wounds. But for all the discomfort, it also felt like progress. One evening, Marcy suggested we see a marriage counselor. "I know it's a lot to ask," she said, her voice hesitant. "But I think we need help, someone to guide us through this, to help us figure out if we even have a chance." I hesitated. The idea of sitting in a room and airing our dirty laundry to a stranger didn't exactly appeal to me, but I couldn't deny that we needed help. On my own, I'd been able to reflect on my part in the breakdown of our marriage, but rebuilding, if that was even possible, felt like a task too big for the two of us to handle alone. "Okay," I said finally. "Let's give it a try." Our first session was awkward, to say the least. The counselor, a woman named Karen, greeted us with a warm smile and invited us to sit in her cozy office. Marcy sat stiffly on one end of the couch, and I sat on the other, the physical distance between us feeling like a perfect metaphor for our emotional state. Karen started by asking us to talk about why we were there. Marcy spoke first, her voice shaking as she explained how she had felt disconnected and unappreciated, how she had sought solace in the wrong places. When it was my turn, I found myself opening up in ways I hadn't expected. I talked about the guilt I felt for being away so often, for putting my career ahead of my family, and for not seeing the warning signs until it was too late. "I don't know if I can forgive her," I admitted, my voice breaking. "But I also don't know if I'm ready to let her go." Karen nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Forgiveness is a process," she said gently. "It's not something you can force, and it doesn't happen overnight. But understanding each other's pain is a good first step." Over the next few sessions, we started to unpack the patterns that had led us to this point. We talked about how our communication had broken down, how we both assumed the other person knew what we were feeling without ever saying it out loud. There were moments when it felt like we were making progress, like the walls between us were starting to come down. But there were also moments when the anger and hurt bubbled to the surface, threatening to undo everything we'd worked for. One night, after a particularly emotional session, Marcy and I sat on the couch together in silence. For a long time, neither of us said anything. Then she reached over and took my hand, her touch tentative but sincere. "I know it's going to take time," she said softly. "But I'm willing to do whatever it takes to earn back your trust." Her words moved me, but they also terrified me. Trust was such a fragile thing, and I didn't know if I had it in me to rebuild it. But as I sat there, holding her hand, I realized that I wanted to try wouldn't be easy. The road ahead was still uncertain, and the wounds we'd inflicted on each other were far from healed. But for the first time in a long time, I felt a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. Rebuilding trust turned out to be far more challenging than I had anticipated. While the conversations with Marcy and the counseling sessions had started to chip away at the walls between us, the scars of betrayal were still raw, and the weight of doubt lingered like a shadow over every interaction. That I wanted to trust her, to believe that she was committed to repairing what we had broken. But every time her phone buzzed or she mentioned work, I felt a pang of suspicion I couldn't shake. It was exhausting, this constant battle between wanting to believe her and fearing that I was being a fool. Marcy, to her credit, seemed determined to prove herself. She gave me full access to her phone, her emails, even her work calendar. "I have nothing to hide," she said one evening as she handed me her phone. "If this is what you need to feel safe, I'm okay with it." Her openness was reassuring, but it also made me feel guilty. I didn't want to become the kind of man who checked his wife's messages or tracked her every move. That wasn't who I was, and it wasn't who I wanted to be. One night, during a quiet moment after dinner, I decided to voice the thoughts that had been eating at me. "Do you ever feel like this is hopeless?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Marcy looked up from her tea, her expression a mix of sadness and determination. "Sometimes," she admitted. "But I also know that giving up would be easier than fighting for this. And I don't want easy, I want us." Her words stayed with me, giving me a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in a long time. If she was willing to fight for us, maybe I could find the strength to do the same. But the road ahead was anything but smooth. One evening, I stumbled across an old photo of Marcy and Dr. Trey on her laptop, one she had apparently forgotten to delete. It wasn't incriminating, just the two of them smiling at a medical conference, but seeing it brought back a flood of emotions. Anger, jealousy, pain. I confronted her immediately, my voice trembling with rage. "Why is this still here?" I demanded, holding up the laptop. She froze, her face pale. "I didn't realize it was still there," she said quickly. "I'm so sorry. I'll delete it right now." "It's not just about the photo," I snapped. "It's the fact that I can't look at you without wondering if you're thinking about him. How am I supposed to move forward when I feel like I'm constantly looking over my shoulder?" Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't shy away. "I don't know how to convince you that I'm all in," she said, her voice breaking. "But I am. I know I screwed up, and I know it's going to take time. But I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." Her vulnerability disarmed me. I wanted to stay angry, to hold on to the righteous indignation that felt like my only defense. But seeing her like that, raw, honest, and genuinely remorseful, made it impossible. "I don't want to keep punishing you," I said finally, my voice softening. "But I don't know how to stop." "We'll figure it out," she said, reaching for my hand. Together. That night, for the first time in weeks, we fell asleep holding hands. It wasn't a resolution, and it didn't erase the pain, but it felt like a step forward. The next day, I found myself looking at her in a way I hadn't in a long time, not as the woman who had betrayed me, but as the woman I had loved for decades. As the weeks passed, Marcy and I started to find small moments of connection, glimmers of the relationship we once had. These moments weren't grand or dramatic, they were quiet, almost ordinary, but they felt significant. One Saturday morning, I found her in the kitchen making pancakes, something she hadn't done in years. The smell of vanilla and butter filled the air, and for a moment, I was transported back to our early days, when we'd spend lazy weekends laughing over burnt breakfasts and mismatched mugs of coffee. "I thought you hated making pancakes," I said, leaning against the doorway. She looked up, a soft smile on her face. "I thought you might need a reason to smile today." It was such a small gesture, but it hit me harder than I expected. I sat down at the table, watching her move around the kitchen, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something close to hope, but just as we started to find our footing, setbacks reminded me of how fragile our progress was. One evening, while scrolling through my phone, I came across a social media post from someone in Marcy's circle, a group photo from the South America trip. Dr. Trey was in it, standing close to Marcy, his arm casually slung over her shoulder. The photo was months old, but seeing it felt like a punch to the gut that I closed the app and stared at the wall, my mind racing. I thought I'd made peace with what had happened, but in that moment, all the hurt and anger came rushing back. When Marcy came into the room, she immediately noticed my mood. "What's wrong?" she asked, sitting beside me. I debated whether to bring it up, but the words spilled out before I could stop them. "I saw a photo from the trip. Of you and Trey." Her face fell. "I thought we agreed to leave the past in the past," she said gently. "I'm trying," I admitted, my voice strained. "But it's hard. Every time I think I'm moving forward, something drags me back." She nodded, her expression pained but understanding. "I know. And I'm so sorry. I wish I could take it all back, but I can't. All I can do is keep showing you that I'm here, that I'm not that person anymore." Her words were sincere, but the doubt lingered. Forgiveness wasn't a switch I could flip, it was a process, one that felt agonizingly slow. That night, I sat alone in the living room, thinking about everything we'd been through. I realized that while the setbacks were painful, they didn't erase the progress we'd made. Trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight, but it could be rebuilt. If we both kept trying. The next morning, I found myself in the kitchen before Marcy woke up. I brewed coffee, just the way she liked it, and set the table for breakfast. When she walked in, her eyes widened in surprise. "What's this?" she asked, her voice filled with cautious curiosity. "A reason to smile," I said, echoing her words from the pancake morning. Her smile in that moment reminded me why I was still here, why I was still trying. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. But for the first time in a long time, it felt like we were on the same team again. As time went on, the small moments of connection began to weave themselves into something stronger. Marcy and I had made a conscious decision to try, to rebuild, to forgive, and to find the parts of each other that had been lost along the way. But the journey was anything but linear. Counseling became a cornerstone of our progress. In those sessions, we delved into the wounds we had carried long before the affair. We talked about the years I spent away on deployment, the missed birthdays, and the times Marcy had felt like she was navigating life alone. I opened up about the guilt I felt for not being there, for putting my duty to the army above my duty to her. "It wasn't just the affair," I said during one session. "It was everything leading up to it. I feel like I failed her before she ever failed me." Marcy wiped a tear from her cheek. "And I didn't know how to tell you I was struggling. I just kept pushing it down, pretending I was fine because I thought you had enough to deal with." Those sessions weren't easy. There were tears, raised voices, and moments when one of us would shut down, unable to face the weight of what we were unpacking. But each time, we came back to the table, determined to keep trying. At home, we started setting aside time for just us, no phones, no distractions, just the two of us. We'd go for walks in the park, cook dinner together, or sit on the porch with a bottle of wine, talking about everything and nothing. One evening, as we sat watching the sunset, Marcy reached for my hand. "Do you remember when we used to dream about this?" she asked. "Sitting on a porch together when we were old and gray?" I smiled, a bittersweet ache in my chest. "I do. I just didn't think it would come with so much baggage." She laughed softly, but there was sadness in her eyes. "Neither did I. But maybe that's what makes it worth fighting for." Her words stayed with me, a reminder that while our marriage would never be what it once was, it could still be something meaningful, but not every moment was filled with hope. There were days when doubt crept in, whispering that I was making a mistake, that forgiveness was impossible. And there were moments when I'd catch Marcy staring off into the distance, her expression unreadable, and wonder if she felt the same. One of the biggest tests came when Marcy was invited to attend a medical conference out of town. It was a professional milestone for her, and I wanted to support her, but the thought of her being away, especially after everything, made my chest tighten. "Do you want me to stay?" she asked one night, sensing my hesitation that I shook my head. "I don't want to hold you back," I said. "But it's hard. I'm not going to lie about that." She nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Then let's figure out a way to make it easier. What if I call you every night, no matter how late? Or text you during the day, just to check in?" Her willingness to meet me halfway eased some of my fears. It wasn't about controlling her, it was about rebuilding the trust we both lost. When she left for the conference, I found myself anxious but hopeful. True to her word, Marcy called every evening, filling me in on her day and asking about mine. Each call felt like another brick in the foundation we were trying to rebuild. By the time she returned, I felt something I hadn't felt in months: pride. Pride in her for pursuing her goals, and pride in myself for taking a step toward trusting her again. That it wasn't perfect, and I knew there would be more challenges ahead. But for the first time, I felt like we were moving in the right direction, not just surviving, but rebuilding. Just as Marcy and I began to find a rhythm in our fragile new normal, life, as it often does, threw us another curveball. It started with a letter, an official-looking envelope addressed to Marcy. I didn't think much of it until she opened it and went pale, her hands trembling as she read the contents. "What is it?" I asked, my stomach sinking. "It's from the hospital board," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're reviewing my work from the South America trip." I frowned, confused. "What do you mean? Why would they do that?" She looked at me, guilt flashing across her face. "Because Trey and we didn't just cross a personal line. There were professional boundaries we blurred, too." She went on to explain that during their trip, Trey had cut corners on documentation, and Marcy, caught up in her own poor decisions, hadn't reported it. The hospital had received a complaint, and now both of their professional reputations were under scrutiny. Hearing this felt like reopening a wound that had just started to heal. I struggled to process what she was saying, anger and frustration bubbling to the surface. "Why didn't you tell me about this sooner?" I demanded. "I didn't want to add to everything we were already dealing with," she said, tears in her eyes. "I thought I could handle it on my own." I shook my head, overwhelmed by the weight of it all. "You don't get to decide that, Marcy. If we're rebuilding this marriage, you can't keep things from me, not anymore." The days that followed were tense. Marcy faced meetings with the hospital board, each one more grueling than the last. She came home exhausted, her confidence shaken, and for the first time, I saw a vulnerability in her that I hadn't seen in years. One night, as we sat in the living room, she broke down completely. "I don't know if I can do this," she said, her voice cracking. "I've already lost so much, what if I lose my career too?" I looked at her, the woman I'd loved for so long, and felt a strange mix of emotions. Anger, yes, but also compassion. For all her mistakes, she was still human, flawed, just like me. "You're not doing this alone," I said finally. "We'll get through it. Together." My words seemed to surprise her, but she nodded, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. Despite everything, I felt myself starting to believe in us again. For every setback, there was a moment of connection, a shared laugh, a quiet hug, a conversation that felt honest and raw. But the real test came a few weeks later when Trey's name resurfaced in a way neither of us expected. A mutual acquaintance mentioned that Trey had been arrested for illegal activities during the South America trip, activities Marcy claimed to know nothing about. It sent shockwaves through the hospital and brought a fresh wave of scrutiny to her involvement. "Did you know about this?" I asked her one night, my voice tinged with suspicion. "No," she said firmly, meeting my eyes. "I swear to you, I didn't. I was a fool to trust him, but I never knew he was capable of something like that." I wanted to believe her, and for the first time, I realized I did. The fallout from Trey's actions ultimately cleared Marcy's name, and though her career took a temporary hit, she emerged from the ordeal with a renewed sense of purpose. Watching her fight for herself, and for us, made me see her in a new light. It wasn't easy, but it was real. For the first time, I felt like we were truly facing the world as partners again. As the dust settled from the chaos of the past months, Marcy and I found ourselves standing on the precipice of a new chapter. The road to this point had been long and grueling, filled with pain, doubt, and moments where we both wondered if we could make it through. But as we sat together one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I realized that we had done more than just survive. We had grown. The fallout from Trey's arrest had been a turning point for both of us. For Marcy, it forced her to confront the parts of herself that had led her to stray, not just the affair, but the patterns of avoidance and self-doubt that had contributed to the distance between us. For me, it was a lesson in letting go of control, in learning to trust not only her but also myself and the decisions we were making together. One night, as we sat on the porch sipping tea, Marcy turned to me, her expression earnest. "I don't know if I've said this enough," she began, her voice soft, "but thank you. Thank you for giving us a chance. For giving me a chance. I know I don't deserve it, but I'm so grateful." I set my mug down, her words hanging in the cool evening air. "It's not about what we deserve," I said after a moment. "It's about what we choose. And I'm choosing to move forward, with you." Her eyes welled with tears, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a sense of peace. In the weeks that followed, we made a conscious effort to keep building on the progress we'd made. We attended counseling sessions regularly, not because we felt broken anymore, but because we recognized the importance of maintaining what we had rebuilt. We also started making time for the things we had neglected in our marriage. Weekend getaways, quiet dinners at home, even something as simple as sitting together and talking about our day, it all felt like laying the foundation for a new version of us. One evening, as we walked hand in hand through the park, Marcy paused and turned to me. "Do you think we can really do this?" she asked, her voice tinged with both hope and uncertainty. I squeezed her hand, a small smile tugging at my lips. "I think we already are." And we were. It wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was real. The scars of the past would always be there, a reminder of the challenges we had faced, but they no longer defined us. Instead, they became proof of our resilience, of our ability to endure and grow. Looking back, I realized that the affair, as devastating as it had been, had forced us to confront truths about ourselves and our marriage that we had ignored for years. It wasn't a path I would have chosen, but it had brought us to a place of honesty and connection that felt deeper than anything we had before. For the first time in a long time, I felt like the future was something to look forward to, not something to fear. As we made our way back to the house that evening, the porch light glowing softly in the distance, I turned to Marcy and said, "Let's keep building this, one day at a time." She smiled, her hand tightening in mine. One day at a time. And so we did.